A soldier's sacrifice, a mother's grief, a hero's legacy. Jack Sullivan gripped the pen tightly, trying to find the right words for the letter he was about to write to his mother. The paper on the table trembled slightly under his hands, not from the cold, but from the mix of anxiety and determination building inside him. The small military barracks at Camp Pendleton were quiet at that late hour, the only sound being the distant echo of boots in the hallway. "Mom, I know what I'm about to do will worry you, but I want you to know that I'm ready. Since I was a boy, you've taught me about honor, courage, and duty. I know this war isn't just ours, but everyone's who believes in freedom. I'm leaving, and I promise I'll come back home." He reread the words, making sure there wasn't a trace of fear in them. The truth, however, was that fear had already become a part of him. From the moment he signed his enlistment papers for the UAS Marine Corps, Jack knew his fate was sealed. The next day, trucks would transport the new recruits to San Diego for intensive training before being deployed to the Pacific. The war had been raging for years, and the stories coming back from the front lines were horrifying. The enemy was ruthless, and close-quarters combat left no room for hesitation. But Jack didn't hesitate. He was only 20 years old, with a heart full of conviction. Morning arrived faster than expected. Jack put on his neatly pressed uniform and tucked the letter into the pocket of his military jacket. In the mess hall, the other recruits looked just as tense. Some tried to mask their nerves with jokes, while others silently ate their meals, lost in thought. "It's today, Sullivan," said a tall, lanky young man beside him, Tom Jenkins. "Are you ready to be a hero?" Jack let out a short laugh. "I'd rather make it back home in one piece before thinking about that." The trucks arrived, and the recruits climbed in, feeling the weight of the moment. The engines roared, the wheels turned, and they were on their way to the unknown. Training in San Diego was brutal. From day one, the instructors made it clear they weren't there to teach anyone how to shoot like in Hollywood movies. Real war didn't forgive mistakes. Jack and the others trained relentlessly, forced marches, hand-to-hand combat, survival under heavy fire. Each day ended with exhausted bodies and minds hardened by the reality ahead. During amphibious landing exercises, Jack got his first taste of the chaos of an invasion. Huge waves rocked the assault boats as recruits, armed and carrying heavy backpacks, leaped into the water and ran toward the beach. Instructors shouted orders everywhere. "Faster! Stay low! Watch for imaginary enemy fire!" Each simulation felt more intense than the last. They trained as if they were already under real attack, and deep down, Jack knew that soon it wouldn't be a simulation anymore. Then, the day finally arrived. The Marines were transported to Pearl Harbor, where they would board the USS Sheridan. As he walked across the deck, Jack observed sailors working, loading supplies, preparing for yet another journey into war. The smell of diesel fuel and the sound of waves crashing against the hull created a strangely calm atmosphere before the storm. The night before departure, Jack took out his letter and added one final line. "Mom, I promise, I'll come back home." Folding the paper carefully, he placed it in an envelope and handed it to an officer in charge of outgoing mail. The next morning, the engines of the USS Sheridan roared to life, and the ship set course for the Pacific. Jack stared at the horizon, his heart pounding, unaware that his destiny was already written in the black sands of a place called Iwo Jima. The sky over the Pacific was gray as the USS Sheridan neared the shores of Iwo Jima. The scent of salt and oil mixed with the tension hanging over the deck. Jack Sullivan stood in one of the troop transports, gripping his M1 Garand rifle tightly. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained stoic. He was no longer just a kid from Boston. He was a United States Marine, ready to face the enemy. Beside him, Tom Jenkins breathed heavily. "Dear God, this place looks like hell," he muttered, staring at the beach ahead. Jack followed his gaze and saw the apocalypse awaiting them. Explosions dotted the black sand of the island, sending bodies and debris flying through the air. The roar of enemy machine guns was deafening. The Japanese forces were dug in, protected by bunkers and underground tunnels. Every inch of that island would be fought for in blood. Sergeant Martin O'Connor walked between the soldiers, his firm voice cutting through the chaos. "Listen up, you bastards. When that ramp drops, you run like the devil himself is chasing you. Don't stop. Don't hesitate. If you freeze, you die." Jack took a deep breath, feeling sweat drip down his neck. He looked up at the cloudy sky and thought of his mother, thought of the letter he had written, "I will come home." But now, seeing the battlefield ahead, he began to wonder if that promise could be kept. The sharp whistle blew. Go, go, go. The ramp dropped, and the world turned into a nightmare. Jack jumped into the shallow water, feeling the resistance of the waves against his legs. The sound of bullets slicing through the air made every step feel like a death sentence. Bodies fell around him, men screaming for medics, some never rising again. The black sand of the beach burned underfoot, stained red with the blood of his comrades. He dove behind a destroyed amphibious tank, trying to catch his breath. Tom collapsed beside him, eyes wide with terror. "We're screwed," Tom shouted, fumbling to reload his weapon with trembling hands. Jack looked ahead and saw what awaited them. The hill, known as Mount Suribachi, was filled with machine gun nests. The Japanese weren't stopping. They were hidden, protected, waiting for the Americans to expose themselves. The radio crackled with the desperate voice of their commander. "Bravo, platoon! Push forward! We need to break through!" There was no choice. Jack gathered his courage and launched himself forward, feeling the ground tremble with explosions. Every step was a challenge against death. He saw a young soldier take a bullet to the chest and collapse beside him. No time to think. Jack kept running. When he reached a makeshift trench, he found Sergeant O'Connor, bleeding, clutching his abdomen where shrapnel had torn through his flesh. "Sullivan, take your men and find an alternate route to that bunker." Jack nodded, pulling Tom and two other soldiers along. They crawled through debris and bodies, trying to get closer to the enemy without being seen. But the Japanese were already waiting for them. A deafening explosion threw Jack into the air. His vision blurred, his ears rang. When he tried to stand, he felt blood trickling from a deep gash on his forehead. Panic threatened to take over, but then he heard the sergeant's voice in his mind, "If you freeze, you die." Jack gripped his rifle and, ignoring the pain, pressed forward. The hell of Iwo Jima had only just begun. Jack Sullivan spat out sand and blood as he tried to catch his breath. His entire body ached, his ears still ringing from the explosion that had thrown him to the ground. But he couldn't stop. The battle raged on around him, screams, explosions, the relentless sound of machine gun fire tearing through the air. Beside him, Tom Jenkins groaned in pain, clutching his bloodied arm. "Jack, I can't move my arm." Jack glanced at the wound. It wasn't good. The shrapnel had ripped through Tom's uniform and blood seeped between his fingers. But there was no time to hesitate. "You'll be fine, Jenkins. Stay down." Jack peeked over the edge of their makeshift trench. Mount Suribachi loomed ahead, its tunnels and bunkers concealing enemy soldiers. The Japanese machine gunners had perfect firing positions. Every attempt by the Americans to advance was met with merciless gunfire. If something wasn't done, the Bravo platoon would be wiped out. The radio in Sergeant O'Connor's vest crackled. The man, leaning against a rock and still bleeding from his abdomen, barely had the strength to press the button. "Sullivan, we're pinned down. If we don't take out those machine guns, we're dead." Jack scanned the battlefield. Only 3 of them were still able to fight: himself, a young soldier named Miller, and a battle-hardened Marine named Davis. None of them wanted to be there, but there was no choice. "I'm going for that right flank and throwing a grenade." Jack pointed toward a cluster of rocks that could provide cover. Davis looked at him like he was insane. "That's suicide, Sullivan." Jack didn't reply. He knew that better than anyone. He took a deep breath, grabbed a grenade, and nodded toward his men. "Davis, Miller, cover me!" The two Marines opened fire, spraying the enemy bunker with bullets to distract them. Jack sprinted across the open battlefield. Bullets whizzed past him, some striking the sand inches away, kicking up dust. When he reached the rocks, he spotted the machine gun nest. The enemy soldiers inside were focused on the firefight with Davis and Miller, unaware of Jack's approach. He pulled the pin on the grenade and hurled it with all his strength. The explosion was instant. The bunker shook, screams echoed from inside, and the machine gun fire stopped. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed another grenade and moved forward, his head pounding, his body screaming for rest. But he forced himself on. When he got close enough, he threw the second grenade directly into the enemy fortification. The blast rocked the ground. Davis and Miller shouted in triumph, "We got them! We got them!" But Jack didn't celebrate. He turned his head and saw another bunker just ahead, and inside, another machine gun was already shifting its aim toward his men. He knew, at that moment, that his mission wasn't over. Jack Sullivan's chest rose and fell rapidly. His heart pounded like a war drum. He looked at the bunker ahead, its machine gun repositioning to fire at his platoon. If someone didn't take it out, more men would die. He knew what had to be done. Jack gripped his M1 Garand and turned back. Davis and Miller were still firing, giving him cover. Tom was on the ground, bleeding but conscious. Sergeant O'Connor leaned against a rock, struggling to keep his eyes open. Jack knew this was his fight. "I'm going for that bunker." Davis stopped shooting and looked at him. "You're out of your damn mind. You won't make it back." Jack didn't answer. He grabbed his last grenade, took a deep breath, and sprinted forward. The world around him blurred into chaos. The black sand burned beneath his boots. The roar of explosions and gunfire filled his ears. The enemy saw him. The machine gun turned toward him. Jack dove left at the last second, rolling on the ground as bullets tore into the sand where he had just been. His vision swam, but he forced himself forward. He was only feet from the bunker. He pulled the pin. The enemy gunner inside swiveled the barrel toward him. Jack threw the grenade through the bunker opening. Time slowed. He saw the flash before he heard the explosion. The structure trembled, smoke and debris bursting out. The machine gun went silent, but Jack was too close. The blast hurled him backward. Pain erupted in his chest as he hit the scorching sand. His rifle slipped from his grasp. His limbs felt heavy, refusing to move. Someone shouted his name. Tom Jenkins crawled to him, ignoring his own wound, and cradled Jack in his arms. "Hold on, Jack! Hold on!" Jack tried to speak, but his throat was dry, the taste of iron in his mouth. He met Tom's eyes, and he knew. He wasn't going home. Images flashed through his mind. His mother's kitchen, the sound of her old record player, her arms around him before he left. The promise he had made echoed in his mind. "Mom, I promise. I'll come back home." Jack exhaled weakly, a faint smile forming at the corner of his lips. He had done it. His platoon was safe. His body went still in Tom's arms. The battle for Iwo Jima raged on, but for Jack Sullivan, the war was over. Silence lasted only seconds before the chaos of war swallowed them again. Explosions continued. Men shouted. The air reeked of smoke and blood. But for the Bravo platoon, something had changed. Tom still held Jack's body, hands trembling. "Wake up, Jack." His voice cracked. "Please, wake up." Jack didn't move. His chest no longer rose and fell. His eyes, once full of determination, stared at nothing. Davis kneeled beside them, covered in blood and dirt, and placed a firm hand on Tom's shoulder. "He's gone, man." Tom felt his face burn, but he didn't cry. He couldn't. Sergeant O'Connor limped over, pressing a hand to his still bleeding wound. His gaze fell on Jack, and he sighed deeply. The son of a bitch did it. They all knew what he meant. If not for Jack, that bunker would still be tearing their men apart. He had done the impossible. Miller gently removed Jack's helmet and wiped the dust and blood from his forehead. "We can't leave him here," he whispered. Tom nodded. Reinforcements were arriving on the beach. The surviving men of Bravo platoon carried Jack's body back to the American lines. Each step felt heavier than anything they had ever carried. They weren't just carrying a soldier, they were carrying a brother, a hero. When they reached safety, medics ran toward them, but when they saw Jack, they simply bowed their heads. Sergeant O'Connor swallowed hard, turning to his men. "We move forward, for him, because that's what he would have done for us." Tom clenched his fists. "Damn those Japanese!" O'Connor's voice hardened. "He didn't do this out of hate. He did it because he knew that if he didn't, we'd all be dead. The best way to honor him is to fight like he did. Jack Sullivan might have died on that island, but his sacrifice would never be forgotten." The telegram arrived on a cold morning in Boston. Margaret Sullivan sat on her front porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands as she watched the mist slowly fade from the street. Since the day Jack had left, her mornings had always been like this, silent, filled with both hope and fear. Every day she prayed that the mist would bring good news. But that morning, what arrived was a military car. Margaret knew before the officers even stepped out. A terrible, crushing weight pressed against her chest, and her hands trembled as she set the coffee cup down on the railing. The door opened, and two uniformed men stepped out. The first was a young army lieutenant, his expression solemn, his posture rigid. The second was someone Margaret hadn't expected to see, Sergeant Martin O'Connor. He looked different, thinner, older, as if Iwo Jima had drained more than just his youth. His eyes, though weary, held something else, respect, grief, and a debt he could never repay. Margaret rose slowly, her movements careful, as if bracing herself for a blow she already knew was coming. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just waited. The lieutenant cleared his throat and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "Mrs. Sullivan, it is with great regret that the United States Marine Corps informs you that your son, Corporal Jack Sullivan, was killed in action during the Battle of Iwo Jima." Time stopped. Margaret felt her knees weaken, but she refused to fall. Her breath became shallow. She had known this could happen. From the moment Jack left, she had known this could be the last time she saw him. Sergeant O'Connor took a step forward, his hands trembling slightly as he held out a neatly folded American flag. "Your son was a hero, Mrs. Sullivan." His voice was rough, heavy. "He saved dozens of men. Because of him, we broke through. Because of him, I'm standing here today." Margaret's eyes fell on the flag. She didn't cry. Instead, she reached out and took it gently, holding it tightly against her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. A long silence stretched between them before O'Connor spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "American heroes never die, Mrs. Sullivan. They only wait to be found." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing those words. Then she looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "My Jack was always a hero, Sergeant." Long before he ever went to war, O'Connor held her gaze, unable to find words. The lieutenant gave a formal salute before stepping back toward the car, followed by O'Connor. Margaret remained on her porch, standing tall, the flag held close to her heart. She didn't scream, she didn't collapse to her knees, but for the first time since Jack had left, the house felt emptier than ever. The Sullivan home had never been so quiet. Since the day Margaret received the news of Jack's death, time seemed to stand still. The radio in the living room, which once played soft music in the afternoons, remained off. The curtains were half open, but no one sat by the window anymore, waiting for the postman to bring a letter from the front. At the center of the living room, on a dark wooden table, lay the folded flag given to her by the Marines. Margaret passed by it several times a day, always letting her eyes linger on the blue and red fabric before continuing on. But she never cried. That night, Sitting in the armchair where she had once sewn patches onto Jack's worn clothes, Margaret unfolded the last letter she had received from him. The edges of the envelope were frayed from being handled too many times, but the words remained the same. "Mom, I promise. I'll come back home." Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the letters. He had, in a way, kept his promise. He had come home, not as she had hoped, but he had returned. The cold Boston wind howled outside. Margaret looked at Jack's framed photograph on the shelf and took a deep, steadying breath. Her son was gone, but what he had done, who he was, would never be erased. Over the next few days, neighbors started visiting. Some brought pies and bread, as if food could fill the void left by grief. Others simply held her hand, saying nothing at all. The men removed their hats as they passed her house, a quiet acknowledgement of Jack's sacrifice. Then, one afternoon, a group of World War I veterans came to see her. One of them, an elderly man with silver hair and an upright posture, removed his cap and spoke in a firm voice. "We know what it means to lose someone in war, but we also know what it means to die for something greater than ourselves. Your son did what few men have the courage to do. Jack Sullivan will never be forgotten." Margaret nodded, and for the first time since that dreadful day, her eyes welled with tears. She did not cry like a broken woman. She did not sob in despair. The tears fell silently, tears of loss, but also of pride. Years had passed since the war. Time had taken many things, but Jack Sullivan's name remained untouched by forgetfulness. On that day, Margaret Sullivan fastened a small golden brooch to her lapel and wrapped herself in her best coat. Her once brown hair was now mostly white, neatly pinned into a bun. She walked slowly through the streets of Boston, accompanied by Tom Jenkins and Sergeant Martin O'Connor. Both men had changed. Tom was no longer the frightened young recruit from Iwo Jima. His injured arm had never fully healed, but he carried it with pride, a constant reminder of Jack. O'Connor, on the other hand, looked as if he had aged 20 years since the war. His eyes still held that hardened battlefield gaze, but now there was something else, an unspoken vow to honor the man who had saved him. The three of them arrived at the town square where a large ceremony was taking place. Flags waved in the wind. Veterans, politicians, and ordinary citizens had gathered to honor those who had never made it home. Among the names engraved on the monument at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii, one stood out to them. Margaret stopped before the polished bronze plaque, running her fingers across her son's name. Corporal Jack Sullivan, 1924-1945. Tom cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have died that day. Jack saved me. He saved all of us." "I'll never forget." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked up at the sky, feeling the wind against her skin. O'Connor stepped forward, his voice hoarse but steady. "He died like a true Marine, like a hero." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment and nodded. "He was always my hero, Sergeant, long before he went to war." As the ceremony continued, young Marine recruits passed by the memorial. One of them stopped, removing his cap. "Jack Sullivan. We learned about him in training. He's a legend." Margaret smiled softly. O'Connor placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Remember this, son. American heroes never die. They only wait to be found." Margaret looked up at the sky. Jack had never truly left, and with that she found peace. Years passed, but the memory of Jack Sullivan never faded. His name remained etched in bronze at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, but more importantly, it remained alive in the hearts of those he had saved. One crisp autumn morning, Tom Jenkins stood outside the United States Marine Corps Recruit Depot in Parris Island, South Carolina. He had been invited as a guest speaker, though he had hesitated before accepting. Even after all these years, talking about Jack was never easy. The pain had dulled, but it never truly disappeared. Inside the auditorium, dozens of young recruits sat at attention. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces filled with youthful determination, the same determination he and Jack had once shared. Tom stepped up to the podium, clearing his throat. "Most of you have probably never heard my name, and that's fine. I'm not important, but the man I'm here to talk about—" Tom paused, looking out at the sea of young faces. He was important. The room was silent. Jack Sullivan was my best friend. We trained together, fought together, bled together, and when the moment came, he saved my life. He saved all of us. He exhaled, gripping the edge of the podium. A lot of people call men like him heroes, but he wasn't some untouchable legend. He was just a kid from Boston, like any one of you. He was scared. He missed home. He wrote letters to his mother. But when it mattered most, he stood up, not because he wanted to be remembered, but because his brothers needed him. A few recruits swallowed hard. Some shifted in their seats, listening intently. That's the kind of Marine Jack was. And that's the kind of Marine you have to be. Because one day, you'll be out there in the real world, and you'll have to decide, are you willing to fight, to stand for the men next to you, even if it means giving everything? Tom let the question hang in the air. He took a deep breath, looking toward the back of the room where Margaret Sullivan sat, her hands resting on her lap, eyes filled with quiet pride. She had insisted on being there despite her age. Finally, Tom nodded. Jack Sullivan never died. He's here, in every Marine who carries on his spirit. He didn't do what he did for medals or glory. He did it so the men beside him could live. He straightened his posture, his voice firm. "And I'm here because of him." Silence. Then, one by one, the recruits stood. At first, just a few, then all of them. They stood at attention, backs straight, eyes filled with something deeper than admiration, understanding. From the back of the room, Margaret wiped a single tear from her cheek and smiled. Jack Sullivan had never been forgotten. He never would be. Many years had passed, but Jack Sullivan's story never faded. It lived in the hearts of those who had fought beside him, in the young recruits who carried his name forward, and in the quiet strength of a mother who had given everything for her country. Margaret Sullivan had grown old, but time had never broken her spirit. She still lived in the same small house in Boston where Jack had once laughed, played, and promised to come home. The house was quieter now, but never empty. Veterans, young Marines, and even complete strangers often visited, each bringing their own stories, their own gratitude. One winter evening, she sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a thick shawl, staring at the flickering flames. On the mantel above the fire sat Jack's folded flag, his medals, and a framed photo of him in uniform, his boyish grin frozen in time. The doorbell rang. Slowly, she rose from her chair and made her way to the door. When she opened it, a young Marine stood at attention, the cold night air swirling around him. He was barely 20, with sharp features and eyes that held both determination and uncertainty. "Mrs. Sullivan?" She nodded, studying him carefully. "My name is Private First Class Daniel Brooks. I just graduated boot camp." Margaret smiled softly. "And what brings you all the way to Boston, Private?" The young man swallowed hard, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small, weathered letter. "I don't know if you ever knew this, but during training, we're taught the stories of the Marines who came before us. Men like your son. Jack Sullivan's name is spoken with the highest respect in the Corps. He's part of who we are." Margaret's eyes softened, her chest tightening. "I know." Daniel hesitated, then handed her the letter. "This was written by one of my instructors. He was saved by your son in Iwo Jima. He told me that every Marine should know Jack's story." Margaret took the letter, her fingers running gently over the worn paper. "Would you like to come in, Private? It's cold out there." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Inside, Margaret led him to the fireplace. She unfolded the letter, her hand steady, and began to read. The words were written with deep gratitude, telling of a sacrifice that had changed the lives of so many. When she finished, she set the letter down and looked at the young Marine before her. "Jack would have liked you, you know." Daniel's throat tightened. "I hope I can live up to his example." Margaret reached out, placing a gentle hand on his. "You already are, son. You already are." For the first time in a long time, Margaret didn't feel alone. Jack's legacy was alive. It had never left. As long as there were young men willing to serve, to protect, and to honor those who came before them, Jack Sullivan would never die. And in that moment, Margaret Sullivan knew her son had truly come home. The end.